The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan airbase as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her medical bag for the third time. At 28, she had already served 2 tours as a flight medic, but today felt different. The weight of her hidden training pressed against her chest like a secret she couldn't share. "Martinez, you're up with Apache 7 today," called out Major Reynolds, barely looking up from his clipboard. "Standard patrol mission. Should be routine." Sarah nodded, her heart racing slightly. Routine missions had a way of becoming anything but routine in Helmand Province. She walked toward the imposing Apache helicopter, its twin rotors gleaming in the early light. The aircraft looked like a mechanical predator, all angles and weaponry, designed for one purpose: delivering precise destruction to enemies while protecting Allied forces. Chief Warrant Officer Jake Thompson was already performing his pre-flight checks, running his hands along the aircraft's body like a mechanic inspecting a prized race car. At 35, Jake had more flight hours than most pilots had driving hours. His weathered face showed the strain of countless missions, but his hands remained steady as surgeon's tools. "Morning, Doc," Jake called out, using the nickname all the medics had earned. "Ready for another scenic tour of Afghanistan?" Sarah smiled, securing her medical equipment in the passenger compartment. "Always ready, Chief." "What's the mission today?" "Convoy escort through the Sanjin Valley." "Intel says it's been quiet, but you know how reliable intel can be out here." Jake's voice carried the skepticism of someone who had learned not to trust easy missions. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, the gunner, emerged from behind the aircraft carrying ammunition belts. At 24, he was the youngest member of their usual crew, but his precision with the Apache's weapons systems had earned respect from veterans twice his age. "All systems green, Chief. We're loaded for bear if anyone wants to dance." Sarah watched the efficient choreography of pre-flight preparations. Each crew member moved with practiced precision, checking systems, loading equipment, and reviewing mission parameters. She had been part of dozens of these pre-flight rituals, but today she noticed details that had previously escaped her attention. The way Jake tested the cyclic control, how Marcus calibrated the targeting systems, the subtle vibration patterns of the engines during startup. These observations weren't accidental. For the past 6 months, Sarah had been attending classified training sessions that officially didn't exist. While her crew believed she was completing advanced medical certification, she had actually been learning to fly and operate the very aircraft that surrounded her daily. The program, known only to a handful of commanders, trained select personnel in cross-functional skills for emergency situations. The training had been brutal. 16-hour days split between medical duties and secret flight instruction. Learning to manage the Apache's complex controls while maintaining her cover as just another medic. Understanding weapon systems, navigation, and emergency procedures that went far beyond basic first aid. The instructors had pushed her beyond every limit she thought she possessed. "Why me?" she had asked Colonel Williams during her first classified briefing. "Because medics see everything and nobody suspects them of being anything more," he had replied. "You've got steady hands, quick reflexes, and the kind of calm under pressure that can't be taught. Plus, you're already embedded with flight crews. The perfect cover." Now, climbing into the Apache's rear compartment, Sarah felt the weight of that training. Her official position was flight medic, responsible for treating wounded soldiers during evacuation missions. Her actual capabilities were far beyond what anyone on her crew imagined. The rotors began their familiar whine, building to the thunderous roar that announced an Apache coming to life. Sarah felt the aircraft lift off, that moment of weightlessness as tons of metal and machinery defied gravity through pure mechanical force. Below them, the landscape stretched out in browns and grays, ancient mountains scarred by centuries of conflict. "Convoy's about 15 clicks southwest," Jake's voice crackled through the intercom. "We'll maintain overwatch at 2,000 feet, keep an eye out for any unwelcome parties." The flight settled into routine surveillance patterns. Sarah monitored radio frequencies while keeping watch through the aircraft's windows. The convoy below looked like toy vehicles from their altitude, moving slowly through terrain that could hide threats behind every rock formation. "This is Overwatch 7, convoy appears secure," Jake reported to base operations. "No movement detected in target area." Sarah had made this exact flight dozens of times. The rhythm was always the same: takeoff, establish overwatch, monitor convoy progress, return to base. Her job was to be ready for medical emergencies, to treat wounded soldiers if combat erupted below them. She was the crew's insurance policy against the worst-case scenarios that everyone hoped would never happen. But, today, something felt different in the aircraft's vibrations. A subtle irregularity in the engine note that her newly trained ear caught immediately. Jake and Marcus continued their normal chatter, apparently unaware of the slight variation in sound. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She began mentally reviewing emergency procedures, not for medical situations, but for aircraft emergencies. Engine failure protocols, auto-rotation procedures, emergency landing techniques. Knowledge that officially she didn't possess. "Hey Doc, you're quiet back there," Marcus called out. "Everything okay?" "Just monitoring frequencies," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the growing concern in her chest. "Seems peaceful down there." The convoy continued its slow progress through the valley while the Apache maintained its protective circle overhead. Sarah watched the ground through her window, simultaneously monitoring the aircraft's instruments that she could see from her position. The engine irregularity seemed to be getting worse, though still subtle enough that the pilots hadn't noticed. Her medical training had taught her to trust her instincts, to notice details that others missed. Those same instincts were now telling her that this routine mission was about to become anything but routine. The question was whether she would have the courage to act on capabilities that officially didn't exist. The radio crackled with routine check-ins from the convoy below. "Overwatch 7, this is Ground 6. All quiet down here. Estimate 20 minutes to checkpoint Alpha." "Roger that, Ground 6, Jake responded. "We'll stick with you until you're clear of the valley." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, running through mental checklists that had nothing to do with medical procedures. If her suspicions about the engine were correct, this crew was about to face an emergency that would test every skill they possessed. The question was whether they would have enough skills to handle what was coming. The Apache continued its steady circle, a guardian angel armed with Hellfire missiles and a 30mm chain gun. Below them, the convoy moved through hostile territory, trusting that the aircraft overhead would protect them from any threats that emerged from the rocky landscape. Neither the convoy nor the Apache crew realized that the greatest threat they faced wasn't hiding in the rocks below, but was building inside their own aircraft's engine compartment. And the only person aboard who might be able to handle the threat was someone whose true capabilities were buried under layers of military secrecy and carefully maintained cover stories. Sarah Martinez checked her medical supplies one more time, knowing that very soon, she might need skills that had nothing to do with treating wounds or saving lives. The secret training that had consumed her life for 6 months was about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible, under live combat conditions with the lives of her crew hanging in the balance. The engine note continued to deteriorate, and Sarah knew that time was running out. The first warning light appeared exactly 17 minutes into the mission. A small amber indicator on the engine status panel that most medics wouldn't recognize, but Sarah's secret training had taught her to read every gauge and warning system on the Apache. Her stomach dropped as she realized her suspicions had been correct. "Chief, you've got an engine temperature spike," she called out, trying to keep her voice casual while her heart pounded against her ribs. Jake's eyes immediately swept across his instrument panel. "I see it now." "Damn, how'd you catch that from back there, Doc?" Sarah's mind raced for a plausible explanation. "I can see the reflection of some of your gauges in the window. Lucky angle, I guess." "Good eyes," Marcus said, but Jake was already too focused on the developing emergency to think much about how a medic had spotted an engine problem before the pilot. The temperature gauge continued climbing into the red zone despite Jake's attempts to adjust power settings. Sarah watched the crew work through emergency procedures, but her hidden knowledge told her they were dealing with something more serious than a simple temperature spike. The vibration patterns she'd noticed earlier were now becoming obvious even to the untrained ear. "Overwatch 7 to base, we've got engine troubles up here," Jake transmitted, his voice professional but tense. "Requesting vectors to nearest emergency landing site." "Roger, Overwatch 7. Emergency landing site is grid reference 77 Alpha, bearing 270 from your position.
Distance 8 kilometers. Sarah knew that landing site.
A small forward operating base with minimal facilities, barely more than a landing pad and some defensive positions. More importantly, she knew they might not make it that far with a failing engine. The Apache began losing altitude, Jake fighting to maintain control as engine power fluctuated wildly. Below them, the convoy continued its journey, unaware that their protective Overwatch was in serious trouble.
Ground 6, this is Overwatch 7, Jake transmitted. We're experiencing mechanical difficulties. Proceeding to emergency landing.
You'll be without air support for the remainder of your route.
Understood, Overwatch 7. Good luck up there. Sarah could hear the worry in the convoy commander's voice.
Without the Apache's protection, they would be vulnerable to any enemy forces in the area. But the crew had their own problems to worry about as the aircraft shuddered through increasingly violent vibrations.
Engines seizing up, Jake announced grimly. We're going down. Prepare for emergency landing.
Marcus immediately began securing his weapons systems while Jake searched for a suitable landing zone. The terrain below was rocky and uneven, not ideal for an emergency landing, but their options were rapidly disappearing. The engine warning lights were now joined by multiple other alarms as various systems began failing in cascade.
Sarah watched Jake struggle with controls that were becoming less responsive by the second.
His skill as a pilot was evident in how he maintained some semblance of control, but even the best pilot couldn't overcome complete engine failure. There, Jake pointed to a relatively flat area between two ridgelines. It's tight, but it's the best we're going to get. The Apache dropped toward the narrow valley floor, autorotating without engine power. Sarah braced herself as the ground rushed up to meet them. Jake flared the aircraft at the last second, trading forward speed for a softer touchdown, but the landing was still violent enough to throw everyone against their restraints. Metal groaned and something important sounding snapped as the Apache settled onto the rocky ground with a final shudder. For a moment, the only sound was the gradual winding down of the rotors and the tick of cooling metal.
Everyone okay?
Jake called out, already running through post-crash procedures. Systems are down, but I'm good, Marcus replied, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. I'm fine, Sarah said, quickly checking herself for injuries before grabbing her medical bag.
Let me take a look at that cut, Marcus.
While she treated Marcus's minor wound, Sarah's mind was already analyzing their situation.
They were down in hostile territory with no immediate backup available.
The Apache's communication systems were damaged, and they had limited defensive capabilities without the aircraft's weapons systems operational.
Radios fried, Jake confirmed, trying unsuccessfully to raise base operations. We're on our own until they realize we're missing. Sarah finished bandaging Marcus's head while considering their options.
The crew didn't know that she had memorized detailed topographical maps during her secret training, or that she understood their tactical situation better than they realized.
How long until they send a rescue team?
Marcus asked, checking his personal weapons.
Could be hours, Jake replied grimly.
They'll have to organize a search and rescue operation, and they won't know exactly where we went down. Sarah looked out at the surrounding terrain, calculating distances and angles of approach. Her secret training had included extensive work on survival and evasion techniques, far beyond the basic survival courses that medics normally received. We should move away from the aircraft, she suggested, trying to sound like she was just thinking out loud rather than drawing on classified tactical training. If anyone saw us go down, they'll head straight for the crash site. Jake nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her suggestion.
Good thinking, document.
We'll set up a defensive position in those rocks over there, give ourselves some cover and a better view of the surrounding area. As they gathered essential supplies from the damaged Apache, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Smoke was rising from several points on the horizon, and the distant sound of gunfire was becoming audible. The convoy they had been protecting was under attack. The convoy's in trouble, Marcus said, hearing the same sounds. They need our support, but we can't help them from here. Jake stared at the damaged Apache, frustration evident in his face.
Even if we could get her running, the engines are completely shot. We're not flying anywhere. Sarah's secret knowledge was screaming at her.
During her classified training, she had learned that Apache helicopters had backup systems and emergency procedures that most crews didn't know about. Classified modifications that could potentially get a damaged aircraft airborne for short distances, even with primary systems failed. But, revealing that knowledge would expose her cover and raise questions she couldn't answer. The choice was between maintaining her secret and potentially saving the lives of the soldiers in the convoy below. The sound of gunfire was getting more intense, punctuated by the distinctive crack of RPG explosions. Whatever was attacking the convoy was well armed and determined.
Without air support, the convoy's chances of survival were rapidly diminishing.
There has to be something we can do, Sarah said, looking back at the Apache. Some way to get at least partial power restored.
Jake shook his head. Not without a full maintenance crew and replacement parts.
We're lucky the bird didn't explode on impact.
But Sarah knew he was wrong.
Her classified training had included emergency repair procedures for exactly this type of situation. Techniques that could potentially restore limited power to a damaged aircraft, enough for one final flight. The procedures were dangerous and not guaranteed to work, but they were possible. The question was whether she was willing to reveal capabilities that officially didn't exist in order to save lives that desperately needed saving. Her cover story had protected her for months, but maintaining that cover might now cost the lives of fellow soldiers. The gunfire from the convoy's position was becoming more sporadic, suggesting they were running low on ammunition or taking heavy casualties. Time was running out for both the trapped convoy and for Sarah's decision about revealing her true capabilities. Marcus was scanning the horizon with binoculars, trying to assess the convoy's situation.
It looks bad down there. They're completely pinned down and outnumbered.
Jake pounded his fist against the Apache's damaged hull.
Damn it.
We're supposed to be their guardian angels, and we're stuck here like sitting ducks.
Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything.
The secret she had protected for months was about to be revealed, but the alternative was watching good soldiers die while she had the knowledge to potentially save them. The sound of an explosion echoed across the valley, larger and more ominous than the previous gunfire. Someone in the convoy had just lost their life, and Sarah knew she couldn't stand by any longer. Her secret training was about to become very public, and there was no going back from what she was about to reveal to her unsuspecting crew. Sarah walked back to the damaged Apache, her hands moving with sudden confidence as she opened panels that most medics would never touch. Jake and Marcus watched in growing amazement as she began examining internal systems with the expertise of a seasoned aircraft mechanic.
"Doc, what are you doing?" Jake asked, confusion evident in his voice.
"Getting us back in the air," Sarah replied, her fingers already tracing damaged wiring and checking fluid levels in places that weren't covered in basic medic training.
"You know aircraft systems?"
Marcus stepped closer, unable to hide his surprise. Sarah paused in her work, realizing there was no way to maintain her cover story any longer. The sounds of battle from the convoy's position were getting more desperate, and lives hung in the balance of her next decisions. "I know more than aircraft systems," she said quietly, meeting Jake's eyes. "I've been trained to fly this bird." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant crack of gunfire and the whistle of wind through the valley. Jake stared at her as if she had just claimed to be able to fly by flapping her arms. "That's impossible," he said finally.
"Medics don't get flight training. The requirements alone would take months of classified instruction."
6 months, Sarah confirmed, returning to her examination of the Apache's damaged systems. "Every evening after my regular duties, weekends, any time I could slip away without arousing suspicion. There's a program that officially doesn't exist, training select personnel in cross-functional capabilities for exactly this type of situation." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "You're telling us you've been secretly learning to fly Apache helicopters while we thought you were just our medic?" "I'm still your medic," Sarah said, now working on a specific panel near the engine compartment. "But I'm also a qualified pilot, weapons operator, and emergency systems specialist."
The training was designed to create personnel who could step into any crew position if necessary. Jake watched her work with growing realization that she wasn't fumbling around randomly. Her movements were precise and purposeful, showing intimate knowledge of systems that took most pilots years to master. "Even if you can fly this thing," he said slowly, "the engines are completely fried." We confirmed that before we abandoned the aircraft. Sarah looked up from her work with a slight smile. "The primary engines are dead, yes. But Apache helicopters have emergency backup systems that aren't listed in standard manuals. Classified modifications that can provide limited power for emergency situations." She disappeared behind an access panel, her voice becoming muffled as she worked on internal components. The system was originally designed for special operations missions where aircraft might need to restart after being deliberately shut down in hostile territory. It can't sustain normal flight operations, but it might give us enough power for one emergency flight. The sound of an explosion from the convoy's direction was followed by screams that carried clearly across the valley. Someone was dying down there while they stood around a damaged helicopter arguing about impossible flight capabilities. "Even if this backup system exists," Jake said urgently, "and even if you can get it working, flying a damaged aircraft into a combat zone is basically suicide. The bird's been through a crash landing. We don't know what other systems might fail." Sarah emerged from behind the panel with grease on her hands and determination in her eyes. "Those soldiers down there are going to die if we don't do something. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, the aircraft might not hold together. But doing nothing guarantees that good people are going to die while we watch from safety." Marcus was monitoring the convoy's radio frequency on his personal radio. "It's getting worse down there. They're reporting multiple casualties and running low on ammunition. Without air support, they won't last another 30 minutes. Sarah had found what she was looking for, a carefully concealed backup system that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a military helicopter. Banks of emergency batteries, auxiliary power units, and control systems that were definitely not standard Apache equipment. "The modifications are more extensive than I expected," she muttered, studying the complex array of backup systems. "Someone spent a lot of money making sure these birds could keep flying even after catastrophic damage." Jake moved closer, his skepticism warring with growing hope as he recognized some of the equipment. "I've never seen anything like this. How long have they been installing these systems?" "About 2 years, according to my briefings," Sarah replied, beginning a startup sequence that was completely different from normal Apache procedures. "Only select aircraft in high-risk theaters." The program was classified above my clearance level, but I was trained on the systems without being told why they existed. The backup power systems came to life with a completely different sound than normal Apache engines. Instead of the familiar turbine whine, these emergency units produced a higher-pitched hum that seemed to vibrate through the entire aircraft structure. "Flight controls are responding," Sarah announced, settling into the pilot's seat with movements that showed far more familiarity than any medic should possess. "But power levels are limited to about 60% of normal. We'll have reduced range, lower maximum speed, and limited weapons capability." Jake climbed into the gunner's position, his hands automatically going through pre-flight checks even as his mind struggled to process the revelation that his medic was apparently a qualified Apache pilot. "Weapons systems are showing green lights," he reported. "Limited ammunition remaining, but the gun and 2 Hellfire missiles are operational." Marcus strapped himself into his position with a grim expression. "If we're really doing this, we need to move fast. The radio traffic from the convoy is getting more desperate." Sarah's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, bringing the damaged Apache back to life on backup power. The aircraft lifted off unsteadily, its movements less graceful than normal but definitely airborne. "Systems are holding," she announced, fighting to keep her voice steady as they climbed toward the convoy's position. "But I can feel structural damage affecting control response. This bird won't stay in the air much longer than necessary." The landscape rolled beneath them as they flew toward the sound of gunfire. Sarah's secret training had prepared her for this moment, but actually flying a damaged aircraft into active combat was beyond anything covered in classified instruction manuals. "Contact ahead," Jake announced, his voice taking on the professional calm of an experienced gunner. multiple enemy positions surrounding the convoy.
They've got our people completely pinned down. Sarah could see the tactical situation developing through the Apache's targeting systems. The convoy was trapped in a narrow valley with enemy forces positioned on the high ground, pouring down automatic weapons fire and rocket-propelled grenades. Without immediate intervention, the convoy would be completely destroyed within minutes. Engaging hostile positions, Sarah announced, her finger finding the trigger for the Apache's 30mm chain gun. The secret training that had consumed her life for 6 months was about to be tested under the most dangerous conditions possible. The Apache dove toward the enemy positions, its emergency power systems screaming under the strain of combat maneuvers. Sarah felt the aircraft responding sluggishly to her inputs, damaged systems struggling to keep up with the demands of aerial combat. Jake's voice crackled through the intercom as he acquired targets through the Apache's sophisticated weapons systems.
Enemy position marked. You're cleared to engage.
Sarah squeezed the trigger, feeling the familiar vibration of the chain gun firing as streams of high-explosive ammunition tore into the enemy positions. The secret medic who had spent months learning to kill from the sky was no longer hiding behind a cover story. The Apache that everyone thought was destroyed was back in the fight, piloted by someone whose true capabilities had been hidden in the shadows of military secrecy.
And the battle for the convoy's survival was just beginning.
But, even as enemy positions exploded under the Apache's firepower, Sarah knew that their emergency power systems wouldn't last much longer. They had one chance to save the convoy before the damaged aircraft would be forced to land permanently. The question was whether one chance would be enough to turn the tide of a battle that had already claimed too many lives.